Today is the day I get to tell you how the new Ford Mustang Mach-E drives. If you haven't already checked out part 1 of this video where I take a deep dive into the exterior and interior design, take a look at the infotainment system, etc., be sure and check that out. Without further ado, let's get out on the road. Since I haven't been able to test this at home, I don't have official 0 to 60 or 60 to 0 times, but Ford has kindly produced some estimates for every different version of the Mach-E. According to them, this version, which is the premium trim with the all-wheel drive and extended range battery pack, should go 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds, and it definitely feels very peppy. This has that instant power delivery that a lot of folks have become to associate with electric cars thanks to Tesla. Honestly, before Tesla created their kind of EVs, most folks assumed that electric vehicles all had to be slow, and that's simply not the case. Electric motors can deliver gobs of torque absolutely instantly, and that's what gives you that throw you back in the seat acceleration that we see in basically all the modern crop of EVs. With the exception, of course, of some of those less expensive, more economy-focused EVs like the Kona EV, the Niro EV, etc. Obviously, the Bolt as well. In terms of comparisons, that makes this model a little bit quicker than the last Tesla Model Y that I drove, but Tesla has released a number of software updates since then, and most folks apparently right now are getting about 4.6 to 4.7 seconds in their base Model Y. Now, the base version of the Mach-E is going to be slower than that, but remember, this has a smaller battery pack available, rear-wheel drive available as well, and those are things that are not available in the Model Y. Tesla decided to cancel the base battery pack and the base rear-wheel drive configuration. So yes, base versions of the Mach-E will be slower, but they're not really the best comparison to the base version of the Tesla. The model that I'm driving instead would be. In terms of 60 to 0 stopping distances, I'm going to guess this is probably going to be in the high 120 range. This model does have 225 width tires on it. There are going to be wider tires available in the Mustang Mach-E depending on the trim level that you get. Tire size is important to keep in mind because the laws of physics can't be denied. Sure, the center of gravity is nice and low, but when you start going around some of these corners, you'll really notice that we don't have as much grip as vehicles that have wider tires. And there were wider tires on the last Model Y that I drove, so I think that the handling win has to go to the Model Y. Stopping distance win is also likely going to go to the Model Y if we're talking about variants with those wider tires as well. But aside from that, the rest of the Mach-E feels very much like those other high-performance EVs out there. That is to say, this is relatively heavy. It's over 4,000 pounds, of course, because we have that massive battery pack. But the battery gets the center of gravity very low in the Mach-E, so this has that same low center of gravity feel. Very little body roll, very little tip and dive, but the levels of grip could be just a smidge higher. I would really love to see what the GT version of this is going to be like. That's obviously going to get much higher performing tires, and the sacrifice for that obviously is going to be range. The range is going to be lower than the model that I'm driving right here. Ride quality is substantially similar to the Model Y and Model 3, and definitely a step below the Jaguar I-Pace. The Jaguar I-Pace has an adaptive air suspension. It definitely has a nice cushy feel to it. And this, on the other hand, is definitely tuned towards the sportier side of things. This is, of course, an electric vehicle with a Mustang logo on it, so they really wanted to give it that sharper handling feel and the firmer ride feel that you'd expect in a Mustang. We also have tires that are inflated quite high. According to the door sticker on this vehicle, the tires should be inflated to 39 psi, and according to the tire pressure monitor on the car, after we've been driving around today, it's 86 degrees outside. These tires have reached about 45 psi. So the tires are inflated quite high, very much like we see in other EVs out there. And that definitely gives us a different driving feel than you'd find in a Ford Bronco Sport or a Ford Escape, vehicles that you might want to be cross-shopping with this on the dealer lot because they're going to be right next to this. They're also Ford crossovers. So if you were expecting the Mustang Mach-E to be an electrified version of the Ford Escape, then you will be disappointed. But if, on the other hand, you expected this to be an electrified four-door Mustang, then you're probably going to be fairly happy with this. Now, this is not going to give you the same kind of driving dynamics that we find in any of the Mustangs out there, but if you want a reasonable amount of power, instant acceleration, and rear-wheel drive, you will definitely find that in the Mustang. And I'm really intrigued by the fact that they gave this rear-wheel drive models as well. Not every EV company out there is choosing to make their EVs rear-wheel drive, which gives you improved driving dynamics, but also some of the competition just doesn't have a rear-wheel drive model. They're all-wheel drive, like the Model Y, or of course the Jaguar I-Pace again. Rather unfortunately, I haven't been able to drive the new Volkswagen ID.4, but based on everything that I've heard from folks that have driven it, and of course its spec sheet, it's obvious that it's a different kind of vehicle. It's going to be considerably slower than all versions of the Mustang Mach-E, especially this mid-level trim that I'm driving right here. Most estimates put it in the 7 to 8 second 0 to 60 range. And the battery pack is not going to be as large in the ID4. Now, a rational person might say that the ID4 is therefore the right-sized EV, and that it's a little bit more rational in its 0 to 60 times, its total power output, and the battery size, etc. But if you want to take things to the next extreme level, that's where the Mustang Mach-E happens. And I have to say, I am really glad that Ford did this, because even as pragmatic of a person as I typically am, and I completely understand where Volkswagen was going with the ID4, I think that if you don't match or beat some of Tesla's numbers, then you're just considered an also-ran. And I think that Ford really took that to heart. Obviously, with everything that is going on here in the Mustang Mach-E, we have acceleration numbers that are very similar to the Teslas, we have size numbers that are similar to the Teslas, we have onboard charging that is very similar to the Teslas as well. We should talk about that for a minute. This has an onboard 10.5 kilowatt charger. So if you have access to a level 2 charging network that can charge at those higher speeds, this will fill up faster than most of the other EVs out there, with the exception of Teslas, which have a very, very slightly faster charger. It's not a huge difference. The big thing here, though, is that a large number of the competition have onboard 6.6 or 7 kilowatt chargers that are going to charge much slower than this. The Jaguar I-Pace, for instance, will charge a lot slower than this on just a regular 220. Now, on the DC fast charge network, this is going to be slower than the modern Tesla Model Y or Tesla Model 3. This will top out currently with this battery pack at 150 kilowatts. It's going to go a little bit slower if you choose the standard range battery. Ford hasn't commented on exactly what the future will hold for this battery pack, but I wouldn't be surprised if the charging infrastructure supported faster chargers at some later date via a software update. We've seen that in the Tesla lineup, and it appears that Ford is willing to make those kind of changes with the Mach-E as well. But obviously, no detail on that just yet. Ford hasn't commented at all. Since we're going downhill, let's talk about the braking. This vehicle has a blended braking system that's a little bit different than we find in the Teslas and similar to other EVs out there. This is definitely my braking system of choice. The reason for that is that if you want low lift-off regen braking, you can just leave it in drive, and then you can use your foot on the brake pedal to slow the vehicle down. It will engage more regen to slow the vehicle down. In a Tesla, anytime you're pressing on the brake pedal, you don't get more regen. The regen is fixed in 2 different levels, high and low. That's lift-off regen, not blended braking regen. Blended braking regen is when you press on the brake pedal and then you get more regen power. We see that in pretty much every other new EV out there. You can control the regen braking in other ways. There's an L button right there in that rotary shifter that engages a higher level of regen braking. That seems to be my preference, just driving this generally out on the road. Or you can engage the one pedal drive mode in the infotainment system, and that will take you to a complete stop. That's going to blend friction braking and regen braking to stop you and hold you at that stop. Personally, I don't like one pedal driving. It just ends up a little too herky-jerky, and I like a bit of a smoother driving experience out on the road, so I like to modulate my own regen braking with my right foot. Although I haven't been able to test this at home, in my quick cabin noise test down here in Southern California, it seems to be a little bit quieter than the Tesla Model Y. Mainly wind noise around the front portion of the windshield and this upper glass panel seem to be a little bit more controlled. I got 72 decibels in here, but again, I haven't been able to test this at home, so that is just a wild estimate at the moment. The other thing I haven't been able to test is fuel economy. I've been driving out here on these mountain roads in Malibu mainly, and the average fuel economy has been about 2.9 miles per kilowatt hour. Earlier in the day, when I drove about 50 miles, mainly at highway speeds and in-city traffic, I was averaging about 3.9 miles per kilowatt hour, so that gives you a general idea of the kind of range you might expect in real-world driving. This is the larger battery pack, this is the dual-motor vehicle, so this theoretically should be EP rated for 270 miles of range. It appears that Ford is a little conservative on their range estimates, so if you're driving this in the lighter driving cycle, where I was getting 3.9 miles per kilowatt hour, and indeed we have 88 kilowatt hours available to the driver, that would yield over 300 miles of range. If, however, you end up averaging 2.9 miles per kilowatt hour because you're driving this at higher speeds, say out on the open highway or out over mountain passes like this, then you might experience range of around 230 to 250 miles. It really just depends on your driving situation. It has been over 80 degrees out here, however, and I have had the air conditioning on, as I typically do in any EV that I'm testing. And just in case you watched the Model Y video where a lot of folks are complaining about the climate control settings, this climate control is also set to 65 degrees. When it comes to the way a vehicle feels out on the road, keep in mind that a lot of this ends up being personal preference. I like the steering rack and the steering ratio that we find in the Mach-E more than we find in the Model Y. The Model Y steering ratio is just a little too quick for me, something that we've also seen in the Model 3. Now, some folks have gotten this confused, but when we're talking about the quickness of the steering ratio, we're not talking about adjustable effort. The Model 3 and Model Y do not have variable ratio steering racks. So when you're adjusting the steering feel in the infotainment system, all you're adjusting is the assist, not the number of turns the steering wheel does lock to lock and how that relates to how the wheels are actually turning up front. The steering ratio in this Mach-E is a little bit slower, meaning that it takes more turn of the steering wheel to get the front tires to do the same thing. The net result of this steering ratio and just the design of the front suspension itself means that this feels less twitchy out in straight highway situations. Where the Tesla Model Y and Model 3 seem to require constant steering correction to stay in a straight line, this goes in a straight line very easily. The Mach-E's steering ratio is still quicker than the average family sedan, so this doesn't feel like a bus or anything like that when you're out in your favorite winding mountain road. I think that they've just found a really good balance. A quick steering ratio like we find in the Model Y and Model 3 will be a lot of fun out on a really tight winding road where you really need that quick agility, or out on something like an autocross course, but I think in real world daily driving, this is a little bit more my preference. Again, keep in mind though that this is more of a preference thing. This does have, I think, a slightly better level of polish to the suspension tune than we find in the Model 3 and Model Y, but the similarities are definitely there. The ride quality feels very much like that Tesla. Bottom lining the Mach-E out on the road is honestly pretty easy. If you've been waiting for a mainstream car company to build a world-class EV that looks and feels futuristic, yet still definitely a mainstream vehicle with an affordable price tag, the Mach-E is definitely it. We saw a mainstream company produce a world-class EV with the Jaguar I-Pace, but few people have bought it because it is quite expensive. The Mustang Mach-E, on the other hand, is considerably less expensive, while giving you similar or better performance to what we find in that Jaguar. And honestly, when you take a look at this interior, the build quality is surprisingly high. Even though we do find some harder plastics further away from the driver, the way the instrument cluster is designed, this large infotainment screen, and just the quality of the parts in here actually feels more premium in some ways than we find in that Jaguar I-Pace. And that's something that I wasn't really expecting. On the other hand, if I can add something to my complaint list, I really wish we could get an electrochromatic or LCD sunroof. This large sheet of glass is really cool looking, and it gives you a lot of headroom in here for the driver and front passenger, very similar to what we find in the Tesla Model Y. But like the Tesla Model Y, I do feel a little bit like I'm in a solar oven when the sun is really beating down hard. It's December right now in Southern California, so the sun is not especially high in the sky, but my head still feels a little bit warm because it is a pretty sunny day. Bottom lining the Mach-E is really easy. This is Ford's game to lose. The Mach-E is priced incredibly well. It's priced sort of between some trims of the Model Y and the new Volkswagen ID.4, but remember, this has the tax credit on it, so keep that in mind when you're taking a look at the price tag, because sometimes the Mach-E may look like it's more expensive than the Model Y, but most shoppers are going to qualify for that full $7,500 tax credit, making this likely a little bit less expensive, depending on exactly how you have the Mach-E configured. There is, of course, also a less expensive version of this than we find in the Tesla Model Y at the moment, because you can get this with the standard range pack and rear-wheel drive. What impressed me most is that I think Ford is being really conservative with the range estimates on the Mach-E. Remember that manufacturers can voluntarily derate range estimates, and it is up to the manufacturer to decide which of the driving cycles they decide to use for those range estimates. So even though this particular model is rated for 270 miles, it could very easily achieve that in real-world driving based on what I've seen down here in Southern California. Now, keep in mind, I haven't had very long with the Mach-E, so that could change once I get this at home. But if you're conservative with this, it's also likely you'll be getting over 300 miles of range. Again, a lot of that really depends on exactly what Ford has done to come up with those EPA range estimates. Tesla, on the other hand, has been really aggressive at driving their range estimates, and keep in mind that this vehicle has considerably more energy on board than we find in the Tesla Model Y. About 88 kilowatt hours usable out of this battery pack. That is about 16 kilowatt hours more than we find in the Tesla Model Y. So logically, in real-world driving, you would hope that this would get longer range, although the efficiency numbers on this are likely going to be a little bit behind what we see in the Tesla Model Y. Of course, for all that, you're going to have to wait until I can get my hands on one of these at home, but bottom line, the Mach-E is incredibly impressive. And if you're looking for a new EV and you don't want to have to deal with the way that Tesla does things, then the Mach-E is going to be an excellent option. Now, that might have sounded a little bit negative, but let me clarify here. I actually really like the way Tesla sells cars directly. I wish that was something a company like Ford was able to do, but due to franchise agreements, Ford simply doesn't have that option. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Check over at aoamerch.com for our latest merch, facebook.com, all the other social stuff, and I'll see you next week.